It's good to see you this morning.
Good morning.
So, as a professor of political geography at the Royal Military College of Canada, have you looked into this issue before? Why is it that Vladimir Putin keeps insisting that Ukraine is dominated by Nazis? Where does that come from?
Oh, look, it's a long-standing Soviet propaganda trope. Where does it come from in the mind of the KGB man in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin? Well, he imbibed it with his mother's milk. I mean, let's not forget that this is a man whose grandfather was in the Cheka, whose father was in the NKVD, and then he was a KGB man. So he's grown up literally believing that Ukrainian nationalists, those who support the freedom and independence of Ukraine, are fascists, are people who collaborated with the Nazis in the Second World War. That's his, I think, probably genuinely believed interpretation of Ukraine and the state of Ukraine and who Ukrainians are. And so when he launched his so-called special military operation against Ukraine a year and a half ago, what did he say? He didn't say he was going in there to clear out corruption or to deal with some kind of territorial issues that had arisen as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which of course he laments. But he went in there and said, I'm going in there to get rid of the Banderivci. He specifically referred to the Ukrainian nationalist movement of the 20th century, and particularly to that faction of it led by Stepan Bandera. Now, let's not get into the nitty-gritty of Banderivci, Milikievich, and so on. Let's just say the Ukrainian nationalist movement more generically. Putin has a worldview in which the Ukrainian independence movement is inherently disruptive. It's inherently something that needs to be dealt with, challenged, fought, suppressed. So his genocidal campaign against Ukraine and Ukrainians today is a reflection of his prejudices. And these are prejudices shared by many of his immediate confederates, his inner circle, but also by Russian society much more broadly defined. And it's a reflection of decades of Soviet-era propaganda, which have been regurgitated by the Russian Federation and perpetuated and promulgated throughout the West and indeed throughout Eastern Europe as well.
You say that it's a Soviet plot, this is a conspiracy, but how do you know that? How do you come up with this idea that it was the Soviets behind this?
Yeah, of course, if the moment you say conspiracy theory, everyone goes, oh yeah, another nut job. No, in this case, we always believed, and I was involved in Canada in the 1980s, we had a commission of inquiry on war criminals. And this came about because there were a lot of news stories and media reports about allegedly thousands of Nazis hiding in North America, in the United States and Canada. And these stories kept coming and coming and coming. We all suspected it was a Soviet disinformation campaign, but we couldn't prove it. It was our reaction. Our emotional reaction was, they're behind it, but prove it. Well, we couldn't prove it until just a few years ago when literally a researcher, Olga Bertelston, looking through KGB archives, came across a document that can be described as Operation Payback or Operation Retribution. And this document from 1985 details in plain English, well, in Ukrainian, but in translation, details in plain language and simple language, the way in which the Soviets planted false stories, what we'd call fake news today, into the North American media to generate tension, particularly between the Jewish and Ukrainian diasporas, but also the Baltic communities as well, over this issue of who did what to whom in World War II. And oh my God, there are Nazis in our midst. We're hiding them. They're the quiet neighbor next door. And this created, as the Soviets brag, this caused such a furor, understandably, of course, in the United States, that in the United States, they created the Office of Special Investigations, the OSI, which then had a mandate to denaturalize and deport anyone who was deemed to have been a Nazi in the Second World War. And when the Soviets saw how successful they were in the United States with this propaganda campaign, they literally say in this document, well, now we're going to do it in Canada. And so in 1984, we had the establishment of this Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals, headed by the late Mr. Justice Deschênes. I was part of that whole process, and for 2 or 3 years, we engaged in a very, I'll have to say honestly, very unpleasant debate with those who believed that we were hiding thousands of Nazis in our midst, and our community, which of course defended its good name. In the end, no Nazis were found in our community. No one was ever brought to justice because there was nothing to charge anyone with. And when you look at the history of this, you realize that these same allegations have been put forward by Soviet agents and their fellow travelers, frankly, in the West, many, many times. So allegations about the Ukrainian Galicia division were tabled right after the war. And when they were in Rimini, held in surrendered enemy personnel camps and then moved to the United Kingdom, there was a furor. When some of them came to Canada in 1950, there was a furor. And all of this was investigated at the time and disproven. In fact, we even have a document in the book Operation Payback where Stalin says, this matter is concluded. That was 1945, and yet it keeps coming back. And in 1950, the British looked into it again. They said, well, look, when we had these men in our camps, right after the war, when the evidence was fresh, we screened them. The Americans screened them. The Canadians screened them. The Soviets screened them. No evidence. Then some of them start coming to the West, to the United States, to Canada, to Australia. Well, understandably, and I want to, I have to emphasize that word, understandably, some Jewish community organizations were upset. Nazis coming, people who served in the SS. This is, of course, outrageous. So they raised protests. Again, there were inquiries. Again, there were findings. The High Commissioner of Canada said, no, this is all Soviet propaganda. He said it in 1950. Skip forward to the 80s, the Soviets are sticking it back into the milieu in the United States and then in Canada. What did Deschênes conclude? This whole issue was, his words, grossly exaggerated. Grossly exaggerated. And he specifically singled out some of the proponents of these claims. And I'll say it like, well, he mocked them in public. He said, yeah, these people made up half this stuff. And so we thought it was all over, and yet it keeps coming back. And of course, someone like Putin, the KGB man in the Kremlin, as I keep calling him, regurgitates this as a justification for a special military operation. And there are more than a few fellow travelers, Soviet sympathizers, believers in the great Russian myth who say, well, that's true. That's true. Now, again, let's be clear, Jason. During the Second World War, there were some Ukrainians who participated in war crimes and crimes against humanity. Absolutely. My own parents who survived that whole period told me what they saw. They never pretended that there weren't bad Ukrainians, but there were bad people, villains in every single community involved in that war on all sides. And we should find those who were individuals who perpetrated crimes against humanity, and if they're still alive, bring them to justice. But do the math. If you were a young man in 1933 and joined the Nazi Party, or for that matter, the KGB or OGPU in those days, or in KVD, the descendants, you're over 100 now, you're dead. There are no Nazis left. I'm sorry. There are no Nazis. Well, no, I'm not sorry. I'm glad there are none left. Some of them got away with it and should have been found and prosecuted, and never were. But the bottom line is they're all gone now. We still have a few Soviet-era war criminals because, of course, the Soviets lasted to 1991. Now, we're not going to get anyone who perpetrated the Holodomor, right? But we might find people who, in the final years of the Soviet system, were guilty of crimes against humanity. I mean, Putin, like, they're still around. So we in Canada, and I can't speak for the United States, but in Canada, we certainly found evidence that there were people living here in the 80s and 90s, and even into 2000, who had committed crimes, as I would see them, war crimes, in the ranks of the Smersh, NKVD, and various other Soviet partisan movements. These were people who openly bragged about what they'd done, wrote books about it even in English, so the evidence was there in their own words, and yet, for some reason, we faced selective justice. There were people who only wanted to talk about Nazi war crimes, but ignored Soviet war crimes. And I'm sad to say, even the government of Ukraine in the immediate post-independence period, 91 and all those years, the government of Ukraine was not interested in bringing the perpetrators of Soviet war crimes or crimes against humanity to justice. There was no lustration in Ukraine. A great mistake was made because Ukraine had questioned its own history in the 90s and early years of this century and brought some of those perpetrators to justice while they were still alive, many things might have been different. But, they were busy becoming free. And I get it. And there was a mentality, a Soviet mentality, that's still there. Remember, and I've said this to you before, when Moses led his people out of Egyptian bondage, they wandered in the desert or the wilderness for 40 years because the people who had been born in slavery had that mentality and could never get to the promised land. Not even Moses himself. He looked down from the mountain, he could see the promised land because all that generation had to die off. So the same thing's happening in Ukraine. There's a generation that's still Soviet in mentality, many of whom are still in the leadership positions, some of the old political elites and so on. They should never have been left in government, but they were. The new generation, the generation that's growing up now, that is fighting on the front lines, regardless of what their mother tongue might be, they are Ukrainians. They want to be part of Europe. They want to be part of a modern state. They're not arguing Banderiuchi, Melnikiuchi, and all that stuff. It's a historical question. They're saying we want to be part of Europe. We want to be part of the free world. We want to be a part of the world in which our democratic rights are respected, where we can have normal lives. So that they're fighting as valiantly as they are because they know what they're fighting for. There's still some of that lag in Ukrainian society of the old guys hanging on. I hope when this war is won, and it will be won by Ukraine, that the remnants of what was have the good sense to step down and step away and let those who've fought for Ukraine's independence take charge and build a different Ukraine. But to get you back to this Soviet disinformation campaign, Operation Payback, as I called it, it can also be called Operation Retribution. This has polluted Western thinking about Ukraine. And if you think back to 1991, if you think back even to 2014, or to the beginning of this escalated period of the war, there were all sorts of Western commentators talking about, well, the right wing, Pravi sector, the Azov battalion, these Nazis, these neo-Nazis, in fact, they just echo, they just, vomit up the Soviet era propaganda, because it's permeated, it's sunk in. And that's going to take a very long time to dispel. But I hope that with Operation Payback, at least, we've now put the proof in front of people. You don't have to believe Lubomyr Luciuk. People say, well, yeah, but his parents came to Canada after the Second World War. They were the Ukrainian nationalists. Of course, he's going to say that. You don't have to believe me. Don't believe me. Don't believe me. Challenge me. Question me. Look at the document. I didn't write this. This is a Soviet era document where the KGB boast, brag, detail, outline, describe how they are going to create societal discord, how they're going to provoke tensions between Jews, Ukrainians, and Baltic communities over this question of alleged war crimes in the Second World War. Were there war crimes? Yes. Were all sides committing them absolutely equally? No, of course not. We should bring any war criminal found in North America to justice using the criminal court proceedings. That's absolutely the fundamental position I took back in 1984, and I continue with to this day. But you need the evidence. In the meantime, we can debate historical issues, the Volyn massacres, the role of UUN and UPA in Ukraine. I mean, these are all interesting questions for me, but most of your viewers might go, come on, isn't it time for us to get beyond Bandera? And I agree, it is. But there are political geographers and historians and political science who will talk about this for a long time. But what's its contemporary importance? And the contemporary importance is we've got to understand the difference between truth and propaganda. And how do you do that? You study the primary evidence, you study the archives, you read books that are peer-reviewed, carefully edited, and understood, not Soviet propaganda. And there are still some people regurgitating it. You still see things being published today in 2021, 22, 23, that sort of, I don't say they toe the Soviet line, but they parallel it, right? And they promote this sort of doubt. Well, maybe these guys, these Ukrainians are fighting now are good, but their grandfathers were all bastards. They were all war criminals. So,
Makes sense. Professor, I appreciate your time today.
okay, my pleasure. Thank you.